I think you know who I am now, so I'll just take that off. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. The opinion section, honestly, is, it's where failed reporters end up, so it shouldn't be held in too high esteem. But it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight, to be back at Collegium. I think this is, my third Collegium event over the years. I might have, if I've forgotten one, I apologize, but all of my experiences have been positive, so hopefully this one will be as well. And it's a special privilege to be here and share in the honoring offered to the Perrys. I should say that in addition to all the incredibly impressive things listed in that extensive biography in the middle of your program, you should also know that Jim Perry finds time to, you could say, mentor my own godson. And you might imagine that my own godson is some, charming lad of 10 who wandered into the Perry's home one day and, sort of broke a crystal goblet but was forgiven for it, and there's sort of some kind of Les Miserables scene or something. I don't know. But no, in fact, I have a very close college friend, and after college, he and I both lived in Washington, D.C., and at a certain point, he converted to Catholicism, which shocked me. It's always the ones you least expect who sign up for Holy Mother Church, and he asked me to be his godfather and sponsor, and I was, and then shortly afterward, he moved to Chicago, and, as a godfather, you worry, what kind of community is he going to fall into, Jets or Sharks, what kind of, street gangs out there, and shortly thereafter, he started telling me, he said, well, there's this really good group of men, and they get together and meet and hang out, and, one of them is a hedge fund zillionaire of some sort, and that was my first introduction to Jim Perry, and since then, I have been the beneficiary of his wisdom and philanthropy as a guest speaker in Chicago, here, many different occasions. I'm trying to encourage him to visit beautiful New Haven. The philanthropic opportunities in the shadow of Yale University are even more ample than the opportunities available here. But anyway, it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for being my friend's friend. He would text me during, occasional challenging times in American politics and say, well, I have this friend, Jim Perry, and he'll be your patron, if things get rough. So I'm keeping that one in my hip pocket. Sort of Medici, Anyway, those things always end well. So So let's talk about the Christian intellectual tradition in the secular university. I'm going to essentially try and talk for a little bit about what I see as the evolution of the worldview and condition of the secular university over the last 20 or 25 years, and then use that depiction to situate religion, situate Christianity in our current, I think it's fair to say, challenging, interesting, mildly apocalyptic moment. But so as you heard, I once wrote a book about Harvard University, a fairly embarrassing one. I don't strongly recommend it, but it has a few good paragraphs in it. But I wrote that after graduating in 2002, which meant that I was a Ivy League undergraduate at the kind of high tide of liberal meritocratic confidence. The late 1990s, when history had ended, the Cold War had been won, a sort of moderate liberal democratic capitalism was carrying all before it. Alan Greenspan had everything figured out. I didn't even take an economics course as an undergraduate because it was like, well, that's set. We don't have to worry about those questions anymore, which made it kind of rough when I started at the Times in 2009. But this was a period in undergraduate life when, as a young Catholic convert who had read First Things magazine as a teenager, I was pretty cool, let me tell you. Um, you went off to college in those days with that, coming from that background, expecting a kind of, a sort of leftist, anti-religion, sort of Foucault reading, deconstructionist, radical chic environment. And that assumption was based on the academic landscape during the revolts of the late 1960s and early 1970s, to some extent on the academic landscape in the high tide of what back then was called political correctness. Now we'd call it probably wokeness 1.0 or something, but that was sort of the world of the late 1980s and early 1990s, the big battles over Western civilization at Columbia University. But by the late 1990s, that kind of campus radicalism was totally in abeyance. If you went to an Ivy League school in the late 1990s, everyone was a careerist, or that was how it felt. My now colleague, David Brooks, wrote an essay for The Atlantic back then. I believe he went to Princeton and interviewed a lot of, bright, young, ambitious Ivy Leaguers, and the essay he wrote was called The Organization Kid. And the argument he made in that essay was that never before in sort of the post-1960s world had there been a generation of ambitious young strivers who were so deferential to authority, had such good relationships with their parents and professors, were so comfortable with their place in the world, were not radical or revolutionary, and were extremely, extremely nice. And as someone who was a student then, I read the essay and thought that all of it was correct except the nice part. Or rather, of course, they were nice to David Brooks, famous Atlantic journalist. But in fact, the atmosphere of the meritocracy in those days was extremely cutthroat, ruthless, ambitious, and worldly. It was an extremely worldly atmosphere of resume building, success for success's sake, but also a very confident one, where you would go in, again, this was before the dot-com bubble burst, before September 11th, you would go in and people would say, well, it's okay, you can major in folklore and mythology and still get a job at McKinsey. And everyone would breathe a sigh of relief and be like, all right, as long as I get the job at McKinsey. So that was the atmosphere then. And to the extent that, there was obviously a campus left, there were sit-ins and an occupation of the Harvard president's office while I was there. But it was a fairly materialist left, in the sense that the occupation was over pay raises for Harvard janitors. And it was just not a sort of culturally dominant force in any way in the university. And looking at that landscape as a Christian and as a Roman Catholic at the time, it felt like a place that was ruthlessly successful and fairly spiritually empty. And therefore, you might say, a landscape that at some certain future point would be ripe for some sort of religious revival. That would be sort of the optimistic take. And that take was correct. We did eventually get a religious revival on America's college campuses. It was not, unfortunately, a Catholic revival, but that, I would say, the arc of the meritocracy over the subsequent 10 or 15 years after I graduated was towards intensification of meritocratic striving, intensification of competition, intensification of insanity in college admissions, joined to a more confident, I would say, a more confident secularism, right? The story of American elite culture over the period from, let's say, 2002 to 2013 or so was one in which religious conservatism in its various forms seemed to be in decline. The failures of the George W. Bush administration sort of merged together with the arguments of the new atheists, the Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens types, together with the decline in religious affiliation among younger Americans, and together with the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. There was a whole sort of correlation of trends and issues that I think encouraged elite America in the view that traditional religion, traditional institutional religion, was increasingly obsolete, and some form of secular liberalism, or with some kind of spiritual patina of the kind that you saw during Barack Obama's first campaign for the presidency, that was the natural future of the American elite. But at a certain point, I think that mentality started to, in effect, exhaust itself, I think, is the right way to put it, and exhaust the students and college applicants and young people who were asked to participate in it. And I think you can see the sort of return of left-wing politics, genuinely radical politics, social justice politics, woke politics, whatever you want to call it, which really gets underway starting on college campuses and then obviously spreading well beyond them in Barack Obama's second term, as reflecting a kind of deep disillusionment with the striving, hyper-ambitious, but sort of fairly morally empty culture of meritocracy that had predominated, let's say from somewhere in the 1980s through Obama's first term. And that reaction, I think, there was the man who was dean, the undergraduate dean at Harvard when I was there, a man named Harry Lewis. While I was a student there, I sort of thought of him as a symbol, as he was in charge, right? What did I know what he really thought? I thought of him as a symbol of this sort of, empty meritocratic striving, right? And then he retired from the deanship and wrote a book called Excellence Without a Soul. And so it turned out that, critiquing the culture that he had presided over. So it turned out that, to some degree, he had agreed with me all along. And that phrase, excellence without a soul, I think captures a lot of what people felt was wrong with elite education in the United States. And so the quest of the last decade or so, again, dominated, I would say, by forces on the political left, forces of identity politics and so on, has been to remoralize higher education, to give it purpose and meaning and direction, to create moral standards by which you can judge the career paths that elite students choose, the decisions they make, the life choices they make, a kind of moral architecture that I think had been missing from the university environment of my own youth. And that was sort of my analysis 5 to 7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago maybe, when sort of campus protest became a thing again, when sort of social justice movements came to the fore again on college campuses. And the argument I made to conservatives at the time was that they should take these movements, not just take these movements seriously, but not just sort of automatically assume that in battles between sort of centrist liberals on college campuses and the progressive left, that they, as serious Christians, should automatically be on the side of the centrist liberals. Because, in fact, in many ways, the arguments from the left were trying to find their way to the kind of language that serious Christians should use to critique a kind of somewhat empty, somewhat soulless ladder of ambition. As I said, that was my argument, 5, 7, 8 years ago. I would say that developments since then have in many ways made me somewhat, you're laughing, Rusty? Somewhat less sympathetic to the sort of arguments and visions associated with the social justice left. I think that there is a sort of fundamental sort of intolerance and anti-intellectualism and, a deep hostility certainly to conservative forms of Christianity and religious faith in general that informs those movements and makes it very difficult for serious Christians to be in alignment with that particular critique of the academy. And for that reason, we've ended up in a world where the natural alignment for Christian intellectuals in these sort of internal to the liberal academy battles has tended to be with the defenders of small L liberalism, the defenders of free speech, the defenders of an open atmosphere of campus debate, as opposed to the would-be remoralizers, the would-be, the people trying to create a sort of firm architecture of commitment, you might say. But I still think that trend and that reality notwithstanding, that the Christian predicament in this kind of environment is real, right? That you have, at the heights of American intellectual life, two forces with, again, conservative Christianity fairly marginal within this debate. Two forces that both require some kind of critique from and correction from within the Christian tradition, that both in different ways manifest some residual Christian impulses, and that both in different ways can be extremely hostile to Christianity itself, right? So if you take, a sort of paradigmatic figure of elite academic anti-wokeness, right? You might take someone like Steven Pinker of Harvard University, a very impressive scholar whose basic worldview is a kind of, sort of crude, if I may be so unkind, crude faith in scientific progress, unleavened by any doubts or any publicly expressed doubts about a kind of implausible hard materialism as a sort of all-encompassing account of human life. Now, that's, again, Pinker is a very impressive figure, and I'd rather have the intellectual atmosphere at Harvard University dominated by the apostles of Steven Pinker maybe than the apostles of Ibram Kendi. But in the end, Steven Pinker is not an ally, not a natural ally of a robust Christian intellectual life in any real way, shape, or form. And at the same time, even in preferring to share an intellectual environment with Steven Pinker, as opposed to share an intellectual environment with Ibram Kendi, you can still see in the worldview of a figure like Kendi and many other sort of writers and thinkers in sort of the broad anti-racist category, archetypes and categories and visions drawn in various ways from a Christian inheritance, from a Christian culture. The idea of the sacredness of a sacrificial victim, the idea of sort of inversion, the last becoming first, and so on, the idea of hierarchies reversing themselves, and then obviously more basic things like a commitment to racial equality and racial justice, right? None of those things are remotely alien to the Christian faith, even if in its current form, elite anti-racism is much more sort of secular and or post-Christian than was, let's say, the anti-racism of Martin Luther King Jr., right? That notwithstanding, those hints and elements and pieces of Christianity are still there in wokeness, still part of progressivism to some extent. And, when we talk about, or when people in my position at least have to do some kind of categorical analysis of progressivism as a phenomenon, we'll tend to describe it, let's say, as a kind of post-Protestant ideology, right? But it's post-Protestant, right? It's not post some random worldview. It's an heir to some extent of the social gospel, mainline Protestantism, some of the core elements of America's particular Christian patrimony. So I think, yeah, I think what I want to stress in describing this arc and this transition is just the challenge and the real uncertainty for serious Christian intellectuals in this environment, trying to build and sustain communities like this one within an environment sort of dominated by these contending forces, to figure out who your allies are and what your arguments should be. And then there are further challenges as well, right? In the world of 1998 to 2002, it was still possible to say there is a secular academy in America, a secularized intelligentsia, but also a kind of robust and resilient sort of mass Christianity as not the dominant force, but a very, very important force in American life. And you could say, you know, circa the year 2000, when George W. Bush is elected president, reasonable goal for a Christian intelligentsia is to take, you know, in those days you would say sort of the sort of alliance of Catholics and evangelicals in American politics and bring the, you know, sort of the robustness of those intellectual traditions into the secular academy, sort of returning religion to the secular sphere, but from a position of relative cultural strength. And that, I think, is just not at all the environment that we inhabit today. Every institutional form of American Christianity is much weaker today than it was 20 years ago. Roman Catholicism, in its American and worldwide form, has passed through a crucible of scandal and then returned in the era of Pope Francis to kind of open theological conflict within the church, where it's much more uncertain what Catholicism as an institution stands for than it would have been at the end of John Paul II's pontificate. And you can say that without per se passing judgment on this pontificate, though I've, you know, been known to pass judgments, maybe unwisely here and there. Perhaps this is just a process that Catholicism itself does necessarily have to go through to find the 21st century synthesis that enables evangelization. But that can be the case, and it still is the case here and now in the American university, that if you say, I'm here representing Roman Catholicism at this moment, it's much less clear what that might necessarily mean than was the case under John Paul II and Benedict XVI, right? Evangelicalism, without sort of going too far afield, has had its own internal conflicts, its own wave of scandals, and under the presidency of Donald Trump has actually seen a significant alienation between its own intelligentsia and the mass of evangelical voters who supported Donald Trump, right? So there's a kind of schism within American evangelicalism where evangelical intellectuals are very uncomfortable with what, not in every case, but with what their own faith tradition seems to represent and support in American politics right now. So that's sort of the institutional condition of the two biggest streams of American Christianity. Both of them, Catholicism somewhat more so, but both of them have seen substantial decline. And again, relative to 15 or 20 years ago, talking about sort of a secular world and a Christian world makes less and less sense as various post-Christian spiritualities become more and more important in American life. So if I go to my local Barnes & Noble and wander into the religion and spirituality section, you know, some of the shelves look the way they did 20 or 25 years ago. You've still got, you know, some shelves of Bibles, some shelves of Catholic and Protestant books, some shelves of Judaica, a lot of shelves of self-help spirituality. But the big change is you now have multiple shelves devoted to witchcraft, magic, paganism, which are, you know, not exactly mass institutional forces in American life, but play more of a role in American religious culture than they did a generation ago. And then sort of to go one step further afield, you also have the realms of sort of places where science, spirituality, Promethean ambition, and Renaissance magic all meet, right? Which you can see happening in, for instance, the fascination with psychedelics and psychedelic experiences as a kind of science-blessed gateway to spiritual experience. Or you can see in, some elements of the AI revolution, right? You can see this sort of haunting fringes, or not even the fringes, of the newfound fascination with UFOs and, sort of extraterrestrial or multidimensional, or, the Nephilim, whatever we might think that these beings might be. So there's just a lot more weird stuff floating around American religious culture than there was 20 years ago. In certain ways, you could say it's just the 1970s come again, right? That, I wasn't alive for the 1970s, but I do remember that as a kid, my parents and their friends, even my parents as Christians, all knew their astrological signs and knew the meaning of their astrological signs. She's such a Virgo, like they would say things like this. And me and my friends were like, what are these baby boomers talking about? Who would possibly be interested in astrology? And now the wheel has turned, and the supermarket cashier will ring up my item and be like, oh, you must be a Sagittarius. And I'll be like, I am a Sagittarius. How did you know? So there is sort of obviously these things go through cycles in American culture, but I think you can also say that relative to the 1970s, the kind of New Age magical landscape, all of these movements are pushing against an institutional Christianity that's weaker, more in cultural retreat, harder pressed to sort of push back successfully. And then these dynamics, this sort of weird spirituality, these weird energies, enter into the two academic intellectual forces that I've described as contending for the modern university. And they do so in a kind of ambiguous way, right? It is, you don't get sort of full commitment to wild metaphysical beliefs from our still quite atheistic and materialist-oriented academic class. But what you get, on the one hand, from sort of the social justice left is a kind of, respect for indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous spiritualities, right? Where, the university in England just announced they're offering a course in witchcraft. And don't worry, they're not teaching you how to cast spells. It's the history of witchcraft. It's all done with sort of a certain amount of plausible deniability about whether people fully believe in any sort of specific magical doctrine. But is there some strong overlap between social justice politics and the witch talk portion of TikTok? Yes, there absolutely is. And then, by the same token, among the sort of liberals who are either anti-woke or are sort of at one remove at least from sort of social justice dogmatism, and especially in Silicon Valley among in the sort of digital age intelligentsia that's often most hostile to some forms of social justice ideology. That's where you have the strongest interest in certainly AI and its sort of attendant spiritual implications, also psychedelics. There's this, and again, it's all sort of done under the patina of, we're just being very scientific here as we take this hallucinogenic substance and, commune with the strange mystical beings who appear to us when we ingest it, right? They're doing science, let's be clear, right? Or when they, speak to the golem that they have conjured up via ChatGPT, it's science at work, right? Don't worry. But still, there's something post-Christian, not entirely secular going on over there. And sometimes it's quite explicit. I did a panel at Catholic University earlier this week with on sort of this weird spirituality subject, and one of my co-panelists was Tara Isabella Burton, who's a writer in New York City who's written a good deal about sort of spirituality after institutional religion. And one of her recent essays was about Silicon Valley rationalists and how the rationalist community, these are people who were sort of, the new atheists plus one, right? They were really just going to be completely devoted to the rule of reason, no metaphysics, no magic, nothing. Well, they've actually turned to, to woo to some degree. I appreciate the laugh. Someone at this event came up to us afterward and said, "I really enjoyed the event, but what is woo?" And for the woo is a term of art that encompasses everything from astrology to Gwyneth Paltrow's recommended, candle scents. It's a new age catch-all, right? But so the Silicon Valley rationalists, the super rationalists, are dabbling in. I mean, you could, it's dabbling in the new age, dabbling in the occult, if you want to be sort of dark and creepy about it. All of this is happening, again, in ways that inform both of the sort of contending intellectual forces that Christians are sort of, in certain ways, caught in between. So it's a challenging, interesting, very challenging landscape. And I think there's a couple ways you can look at the Christian situation in that landscape. There's sort of a sort of weaker prescription and a stronger prescription that you can give Christians engaged in intellectual life, engaged in argument, engaged within communities, within places like Penn. And the kind of weaker prescription is that, in effect, Christians should be looking at what is residually Christian within these contending ideologies and trying to persuade the people so contending that that their worldviews are still more dependent on Christian premises than they themselves like to imagine, and that they effectively need Christian ideas, Christian arguments, the Christian metaphysical picture for their own perspectives on the world to fully make sense. So a couple examples of what this would look like on the kind of woke, progressive, social justice side of things. There is a sense in which a lot of secular progressive rhetoric nowadays seems to offer a kind of vision of sort of sin without the possibility of redemption, right? Where, you're sort of enmeshed in these structures of oppression and persecution and, hierarchies of power and so on. But there's that, again, sort of bear some resemblances to Christian concepts, but do so without any kind of sort of promise of ultimate hope in the arc of history, any kind of promise that once you become aware of your own privilege and your own complicity in these structures and these forms of sinfulness, that you can be forgiven and restored and made new because there's no God to actually do that. And that in effect, sort of as progressivism has secularized and cut itself off from the eschatological, it has ended up sort of offering a narrative that seems to be reformist, seems to be revolutionary, but ultimately points towards a kind of cosmic despair. And this is going to be quite open in, my former Atlantic colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you read sort of when he writes about religion and sort of Christian perspectives and his view of the civil rights movement and so on, especially in his essays from early in the 2010s, when sort of he's one of the kind of progenitors of the woke turn, there's just a sort of frank pessimism that, you know, he's describing a world of oppression and oppressed, and, you know, you can fight against it, you know, you can do what you can against it, but there's no cosmic optimism of any kind in that narrative. And so to the extent that that's true, then the kind of Christian prescription is to say, yes, your thirst for justice, your desire for equality is healthy and good and necessary. It just needs to take its place within a picture of the universe in which there is actually hope that justice can be ultimately delivered, and that the oppressor can be forgiven and restored and not exist in a constant state of sort of re-education, which is effectively where, you know, in place of justice and restoration, you have a kind of permanent re-education as the model for a lot of sort of woke prescriptions, right? So that's sort of something that, in a way, Christianity can reasonably offer to the progressive side. And then to the kind of centrist liberal side, it can offer something in many ways similar, that, you know, centrist liberalism relative to progressivism is much more focused on rights, the inviolability of rights, the right to free speech, the right to free expression, which, again, the left is more likely to see in terms of sort of, you know, the oppressed and the oppressors should have different rights because of the, you know, structures of injustice. Centrist liberalism is much more committed to a more absolutist vision, more sort of, you might say, much more committed to a vision of natural rights and natural right. And here, too, I think it is entirely reasonable for Christians to point out and emphasize the dependence of any compelling version of that tradition on something more than hard Darwinian materialism. This is the fundamental dilemma of any kind of secular liberalism, is that its fundamental premises are religious, and as it shears itself away from its religious origins, it essentially, this is not even a remotely original point, but it essentially is sort of demanding fealty to moral absolutes that have no sort of correlative in its picture of what the universe is and what human beings are. And this is a place where historically Christians have been fairly successful, I think, in arguing with liberals and pulling liberals back towards taking religion seriously, taking God seriously. And it might be that that can happen in the current environment again, especially since the rise of wokeness itself has, I think, convinced a lot of once confident champions of enlightenment that actually just getting rid of Christianity and organized religion does not automatically make the world, a perfect place run by Daniel Dennett and Steven Pinker. That has not turned out to be remotely the case. So there are opportunities there, right? But, and this is where I'll end, those are both weak prescriptions, right? And they are prescriptions that sort of assume that Christianity exists as a kind of, corrective to dominant tendencies, as a kind of supplier of metaphysical scaffolding for dominant tendencies, and where Christians are successful, have been successful in periods in the modern world in performing this kind of work, their triumphs have tended to be fairly short-lived, right? So if you go back to the period of Martin Luther King, the period of the 1940s and 1950s, right, you had a fair amount of sort of intellectual and cultural success for Christian thinkers, basically saying to liberals at that point, look at where you ended up without God, right? You ended up with the Gulag, you ended up with Auschwitz, you ended up with Hiroshima. Maybe you want to come back to Augustine. Maybe you want to come back to a vision of original sin. maybe you want to come back to some kind of belief in God, right? And a lot of trends in post-war Western intellectual life can be understood as a certain number of intellectuals sort of recoiling from where Western civilization went without Christianity and returning for a time to some kind of relationship with Christian faith. And this is the age that gave us the civil rights movement. It's the age that gave us Reinhold Niebuhr and Protestant neo-orthodoxy. It's the age of Fulton Sheen, to pick a Catholic example, and it's the age of Billy Graham. It's, in many ways, remains the most sort of successful age of public Christianity, popular and intellectual, in the last 100 years or so. But there was in that period always a sense that at least some intellectuals were returning to Christianity instrumentally. That it was, we don't like where the world goes without Christianity. We want some kind of justification for our belief in human rights. You know, we need a little Catholicism to get to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. We need Jacques Maritain to come in and sort of help us make this all make sense. But then, at the ultimate point of a question, of sort of the core substance of Christianity, the miraculous, the resurrection, the disreputable stuff, right? Some of those intellectuals were a little bit ambiguous and uncertain about what they actually believed. There's a great novel called The Flight of Peter Fromm by Martin Gardner, who was a famous skeptic who was also sympathetic to Christianity in certain ways, but it's semi-autobiographical, but it's about a young man who sort of, at mid-century, goes from a sort of Moody's Bible College world up into the heights of, there's a little Catholicism, but it's mostly sort of Protestant intellectual life at mid-century. So it's the world of sort of a Niebuhr, Norman Vincent Peale, and so on. And he ends up in crisis because he can't get these sort of grandees of mid-century Protestantism to actually say one way or another whether they believe in something like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? And this ultimately, I'm forgetting the exact details, but it leads him to a kind of mental breakdown and some sort of loss of faith in the end. And I think there's a lesson there that certainly I try to be mindful of in my own work, right? That like it's always sort of easiest in dialogue with a secular intelligentsia to emphasize the ways in which Christianity is useful for secular intellectual projects, be they left-wing over here or liberal over here, and obviously this can apply to conservatism as well, but if we're talking about American academia, that's not the central subject. I can come back and talk about populism and Donald Trump another time, but that is always sort of the easiest and most straightforward way, but without ever sort of bringing things to the sharp point of full belief in sort of the scandalous and, to the secular mind, implausible seeming aspects of Christianity. And I guess my view right now is that in this increasingly weird and unsettled religious environment, in a landscape of sort of centrist liberal crisis and doubt in the liberal project, in an environment of left-wing zeal on the one hand, but also a lot of left-wing despair. I think one of the stories of woke progressivism is that it is a revolt against liberalism that goes in search of meaning, but has ended up even more depressed than when it began. That certainly seems to be, you could call it the sort of Greta Thunberg arc of, sort of ultimate pessimism, right? In this environment, well, put it this way, Christians always have an obligation to make the full case for Christianity. But I think in certain ways the environment is for the full case, resurrection and all, is more propitious now, and perhaps likely to become even more propitious if things get even weirder and the Nephilim descend in their spacecraft, over the next 10, 20 years, over the next generation in the work of the Collegium. And so I think that is ultimately, even from a position of difficulty and weakness, how Christians need to think about what their own intellectual tradition offers to the secular university. It can't just be a corrective and a supplement. It has to be, in the end, a full alternative vision of the world, distinct from left and center, and I think as compelling now, if not more so, than it's ever been. So, thank you.